former General Counsel to the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee, Deputy Counsel of the President's Commission on Organized Crime, Assistant United States Attorney in Washington, D.C., and current partner and government practices lead at the prestigious law firm McDermott, Will & Emery. Please welcome to the stage one of Washington's premier crisis management attorneys and globally recognized legal authorities on the intersection of technology, procurement, and politics, Steve Ryan.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to say this room was rocking last night, and I'm going to rock you a little bit this morning, just a little bit. But wasn't that great? I don't know that we're ever going to be able to duplicate the high of last night. Well, maybe not high is not the right word. But anyway, let me start by saying how much I appreciate Don Upson continuing the friendship we began. I was the Democratic Chief Counsel of the Investigations and Operations Committee in the Senate, and Don was my Republican counterpart on the House Committee. And we always knew that our enemy was the Armed Services Committee, not our opposing party counterpart. And so I actually have tried always to be bipartisan, and I'll try to have my remarks bipartisan today. My slides will not get me in trouble, but what I say to you may, so pay attention today. Let's start, if we can, by throwing the slides up there. Is that going to happen? There we go, perfect. And let's start with the volatility and parliamentary nature of our election cycle. The point I want to make to you here, and the data is up there, is that we are in a period where the public continues to throw the rascals out. They switch parties. There are a lot of sweep elections. A sweep election is when the House, Senate, and presidency changes. And then other elections where one of the bodies change. I've marked that. And if you just look, there are only 2 times in the past 20 years, 18 years actually, that there have not been the change of one of the bodies, and there have been large numbers of changes and high volatility. So that in 2006, Republican would have been withdrawn from the shelves if it was a dog food, but by 2010, the Republicans had won back the House, which shows that the electorate is highly polarized. So what can we say about that electorate? Now, everybody here could find somebody who's not an example of this, but the Democratic Party is urban and suburban. It's women, it's black, it's non-white, it's Jewish, it's highly educated, it's LGBT, and it's younger. Republicans are rural and suburban, evangelical, white, in the males, lower educated. They're anti-abortion, pro-Second Amendment, and they're older. Now, every one of us could fit ourselves into the other category, but if you look at the demographics of voters, there are trend lines here. And these trend lines make us 2 countries. There's a coastal, educated elite on the coasts and in certain areas. And then there's a rural America, neither of which are contested anymore. The one is Democrat and the other is Republican. We'll go back to the slides, perhaps. There we go. So I want to show you how close the last election is, because I'm going to ruminate a little bit about what we have coming up. If you look there, and I'll let you do the numbers, you see that there were 6 states in play with about 200,000 votes, honestly. And it wasn't just Hillary Clinton who lost the election by a small margin. There were states that the president could have carried with the transition of a small number of votes. So the Electoral College result is already an interesting way to think about the battlegrounds. So I think if you put all those states up that were that close last time, add other states, Florida, Nevada, Arizona, you'll get a picture of where the battlegrounds are this time. And I think that there's a lot of interesting work that's being done to do this. Now, let's talk about the presidency. There are simple rules about who gets elected. The taller person gets elected. You know, that's an interesting one. What is a more interesting trend is the person who's the non-establishment figure often gets elected. Let's go back over who's been a non-establishment figure. Bill Clinton came in and beat the Democratic establishment and became president of the United States. He was not an establishment figure. When President Trump was elected, he really is not an establishment figure, right? Barack Obama beat Hillary Clinton in the primary, so a person with limited political experience beating the other. So that means Buttigieg is going to be the president of the United States if he grows about a foot in the near future. If we look at the presidency, there was one president in the 20th and 21st century who came in with the economic record of this president and lost, and that was in the 1920s. So the economy's stupid. If it's the economy's stupid, the president has won. And the one thing we know is that the president's going to be the nominee of the Republican Party unless Bill Weld in New Hampshire takes 30 to 40% of the vote. That's the only black swan event that could affect the president's easy walk to the nomination. But when we look at this business of not favoring people who have a pedigree of understanding government, of knowing, you know, who is who in the international regime, we end up with an interesting situation. One of the quotes that I think is the most important quote was by a strategist named Stephen Posny. Sorry about banging my microphone. Stephen Posny said, "Prestige is the credit rating of nations." And I want you to think now about the various presidents we've had and whether they really understood that phrase, prestige is the credit rating of nations, and how each of them have affected that prestige. So as we look forward into the presidential campaign, I honest to God can't tell you who's going to win on the Democratic side. I thought John Glenn was going to be president of the United States. I based my entire career on that, and we know how that turned out. You know, I've been with a series of losers. I was a finance director on Senator Kerry's campaign. So if you really want to know who's going to win, you don't ask me. Let's go forward, and we will talk about the Congress. Now, how many of you ever believed that term limits was a great idea? Put them up, put them up. Okay, well, it's nonsense. I mean, let me tell you, look at the numbers here on the changes in Congress. Those of you who wanted to make sure that people didn't stay too long, the numbers here are astounding. There were 83 new members of Congress alone in the class of 2018, and I'll talk more about that class of 2018 because it is the future picture of our electoral activity. I think I've got an error here. It's actually 17 Republicans and 4 Democrats. 21 have announced, 21 Republicans heading to 25 are not going to run for re-election. If you add that to the 40 Republicans who departed in 2018, there's an enormous turnover and churn. And so I have the numbers on that, and I'm showing them to you. You know, and then we always have the resignations and the deaths and running for other office. But the turnover is just enormous. And so the House will be in play again. But how did the Democrats win the House in 2018? Well, they ran it because it was a national election about the President of the United States, and they ran good candidates. And in 2018, the President of the United States was not very popular. He had his base, and his base turned out, but he didn't have the independents, the women, the highly educated, and we'll go through some of the demographics. But I'm not sure that that's going to be the same electorate in 2020. I am not sure about it. And there are many events between that election and this coming election that will be different. After the week that we just went through, I think you all know exactly what I'm talking about. So if we look at the numbers, there's no need for term limits because we are basically terminating the positions of members of Congress at a very, very high rate. The Senate is probably still not in play, by the way, notwithstanding that this time Republicans have to defend a very large number of seats. And there are a handful of Republican senators that are very vulnerable in Colorado, in Alabama, and in Arizona, and in other states, not because they're bad senators, but because of the demographics of their state changing. But the Democrats still don't have a very good chance of taking the Senate because the split of electorate is that many of them are plain states and states that the Democrats are just not competitive in. So we'll go forward from there. I want to introduce to you a couple of players that this room needs to understand are changing. And I put these up as representative. I could have gone through 10. How many of you know Carolyn Maloney in New York? Put up your hand. Okay, well, you ought to know Carolyn Maloney in New York because she's the chairman now, having taken Mr. Cummings' place, and she knows about procurement. She got elected to the City Council of New York on a platform of cleaning up procurement in the city of New York. She's a former beauty queen from Virginia who married well. Her husband died on K2 in a climbing accident. And she's now the chairman of the largest committee that we deal with in terms of the rules of government procurement. So if you don't know Carol Maloney, this is the difference for me now. I used to walk the halls of Congress and I knew everybody. They may not have liked me or they may have liked me, but I knew every single one of them. I knew who they were. And now in this, a very sophisticated room, you don't know your chairman, okay? Jim Jordan is her Republican counterpart. And Jim Jordan is a guy who's best in the minority as opposed to the majority. It suits his personality and his combativeness. The guy who just left as the Republican ranking member and previous chairman, Mark Meadows, is the next chief of staff as president of the United States. So within the political arena, those of us who are trying to be players on behalf of our clients, and I like to think that I am, are always constantly looking at this churn and having to change our relationships. Luckily, I've been with Mrs. Maloney for decades, literally, as a friend. And I like Congressman Meadows a lot, even though we don't have much in common politically, and I've done things with him. So, you know, you have to change with the times, and you also have to change with the times in knowing who your leaders are. Let me go on. How many of you playing with pain this morning, huh? How's it going out there? Little sweat, you know, but it's nice of you that you turned up for me. I'm very grateful. So, you know, my next slide, this is not something, I think I've gone two. Let me go back one. Back. Maybe, maybe not. Well, we'll go with this one. Oh, there it goes. They did it for me. This is my summary slide on the House and the Senate. And the fourth point is the point I really want to focus on. Who was the darling of the left who everybody thinks is the most important member of Congress? Well, it's AOC and the posse, right? They eliminated two really decent Democrats. Joe Crowley of New York might well have been the next speaker. That is, if Mrs. Pelosi, well, anyway. But when she took out Crowley, she represented the same thing that Senator Lee did when he croaked a perfectly good conservative in Utah, senator. It created waves of fear in the Democratic and Republican Party. The Republican members have lived with that fear of being Tea Partied and outrighted for a decade and a half or longer. The Democrats now are living with the fear of being outflanked on the left. And it is going to change our politics, and not in a good way. The Republican Party, in the post-Mike Lee victory over his opponent, became a party where members said, "You will never beat me on the right. I will move to the right because I will not lose my primary. And AOC has the same result on the Democrats, that they don't want to be outflanked on their left. And the average age of the Democrats in Congress is significantly higher than the Republicans. The Republicans' average age has actually managed to change. As you saw, McCarthy's a younger person than Pelosi. Steny Hoyer, Pelosi, and Clyburn, the three leaders, are all in their late 70s. And so the vulnerability of a Democratic electorate changing its views of someone like Carolyn Maloney, who's 70 years old and from New York, or Jerry Nadler, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, there's going to be a large fallout in the Democratic Party because of this, but it's also driving the party left, just as Mike Lee drove the Republican Party right, and the president. Now we can go to the slide about the president and how well he's running. Oh wait, this is my favorite too. I just thought I'd give you a bit of poetry about congressmen and how they view their jobs. They work really hard. I won't recite the poem to you, but I think it sums up the views of somebody who works 12 to 16 hours a day and has to raise money from people like us who give them contributions. And I want to talk about one aspect of that, the hygiene of how you give money to congressmen. You do not mix your contract or your issue while you're giving the money. There's a Supreme Court case that says the only way that your contribution becomes a bribe is if you commingle those two discussions. So have the good grace to avoid a felony conviction, and when you're giving your money, talk about their race and how important you think they are, and wait, and then a week later or a week before, go and talk to them about your substantive problem. I actually sometimes absolutely cringe at the fundraisers I'm raising. None of my clients do this because they're all schooled, but I have been at a lot of places where people make the mistake of doing that, and frankly, it's becoming almost accepted, except that it's a felony. So anyway, there's a point that we want to talk about. So let's talk about the president just for a minute. And obviously, the churn of cabinet members and the churn of White House leadership. How many of you slept better when General Kelly was in the White House? I'd have to say, you know, there are people that you want to put your trust in. And the president basically has decided he doesn't really need any of those people. And one of my closest and dearest friends was a cabinet member under him, and I was his lawyer. And when he got in a bit of hot water in terms of press reports about him, and everybody gets in trouble, you know, in the city, in the naked city, there are 8 million stories, and you know, he was one of them. But the president assured him on an afternoon that he was fine, and then fired him on Twitter during the evening or morning the following day. And of course, it's stuff like that that for someone like me who is code. One time, John Glenn said to me, you know, if you've made a mistake on this, I'll have to ask for your resignation. And I said, Senator, you'll never have to ask for my resignation. I'm code. I'll leave because you should never have to fire me. And John Glenn was, in my view, the beau ideal of what we should be looking at in terms of how people act in office. But what we have is a presidency where the president's actually quite satisfied to have acting leaders at cabinet agencies, because they can't do anything unless the president agrees. Having an acting leader means that the White House has much greater authority and control over that person, and I think the president is really not unhappy when he has a large number of acting cabinet members. So this is, you know, there are many aspects of the president. One is the economy being so successful. This is another aspect, and it's, to me, not an attractive one. Let me talk briefly about the voters. I'm putting up only a few statistics. The statistic that's even more astounding, I'm not putting up is the women. If you look at the woman's vote in 2016 and 2018, suburban women who previously supported Republicans are entirely with the Democratic Party. Not everyone, right? But as a bloc, there was this enormous movement here. And it's interesting that women are willing to change their votes more than men. And I put this up, which may not surprise women, that men don't change and are unchangeable. But if you look at men without a college degree and sort of what we would think of as blue collar or other, their views politically are not changing, right? But white men who are college educated, their views have changed. And I find that interesting because the women have changed and that, but some of these core bases, when I rattled off that list that may have insulted you at the beginning about who each party is, there is a truth to that. 78% of evangelicals voted with the president. So, I'm sure there's an evangelical in the room who didn't, but we don't know who you are. So non-white versus white, at some point in the very near future, the United States will have a rough equilibrium of non-white versus white voters for the first time. That will occur between 2030 and 2050. It will take that long because people who are highly educated, have high SES, vote, and other groups as they come into the economy, if you have low SES, you tend not to vote, right? There's a difference in who turns out to vote. Older people turn out to vote. Younger people who deeply feel politics are not, and who are aligned with the Democrats. So the key to the election that we have coming up is who's actually going to go to the polls. And the reason the pollsters have been off, they were off in 2004 in the Kerry-Bush election. They were dreadfully off in the Obama original election. They were dreadfully off in 2016. It's not just the Trump shaming that some people think about in 2016 that kept the polls wrong. People were measuring the electorate from the last election, and the people who showed up were a different electorate. So for example, when we were doing our outtake polls in 2004, I was with Senator Kerry's campaign, and I looked at who was voting in Ohio, and I thought we had won the election, except that the Republicans had registered more voters and turned them out than we had expected, right? Ohio was the pivot of that election, as Florida was the pivot of the 2000 election. And so as we look at data like the one I had up on the screen a moment ago, that's the kind of data that really is changing the world that we live in. Let me go to a slide that I want to talk about for a minute now. So how many people in this room have taken an oath to the Constitution at least one time? Please put up your hand. Now, for those of you who are contractors, how many of you get up every day and feel you work for the taxpayers when you're in this business in the same way that your government counterpart did? Because I can put up my hand and say, I have never felt in industry that I don't represent the taxpayers of the United States when I work in this industry so integrally related to government. We have to be on a mission together. It's why NASA was so great in the 60s when my boss flew in space the first time. And so the mission continues for all of us. The mission is to defend this country, to make its life better, and we have a lot of challenges coming at us. What has changed is our industry was sacrosanct in the Congress of the United States. We convinced them, the Silicon Valley leaders convinced them that they were too dumb to understand the internet and they could only it up and therefore leave us alone. Well, that's over, by the way. That is over. And you can see it globally in the growth of GDPR in Europe, this idea that entrecote-eating French bureaucrats in Brussels would impose the privacy rules that are going to prevail globally that are extraordinarily good for lawyers. My European law offices, which are generally not terribly profitable, have been wonderfully profitable because of GDPR. Thank you very much, Brussels. But the idea really has become, I think, different. Our industry is so central to the economy that the government will no longer tolerate us doing things on our own and trusting that it will work out okay. Those days are very much over. What's also over is the toleration for the fact that the Iranians attack the US banking sector 2 days a week, every week for the last 5 years as their answer to Stuxnet. Now, there are a lot of attacks going on, and a lot of my law practice has come to focus on breach. And the most interesting breach attacks are breaches against government contractors, because you are in a very perilous situation if you're breached. Because here's the rule, and I learned it in the USIS case. If you are penetrated by the Chinese and you detect it, stop it, and report it, your company could be destroyed, even when your reporting agency, OPM, lost every file to the Chinese, and almost without consequence. So there's one of the interesting tactical issues that we deal with now is breach. And the good news I can tell you is that in my law practice, the FBI and the authorities have generally been very good to government contractors who self-report. But there's always the chance you're going to end up like USIS. So interesting issues that we face that are very, very practical depend on the view of cybersecurity. The next speaker after me will be a gentleman who's the CIO of IRS. And I can tell you that at the leadership level of IRS, when an account takeover attack occurs, an account takeover attack is when your data, an individual taxpayer's data, has been lost in the Anthem breach, or the Target breach, or the JP Morgan breach, or the you name it breach, where your data went out and now it's being used in the tax area to steal your refund. When we report as the industry to that, and I'm deeply involved in that, IRS understands the difference between a breach attack and account takeover attack. And so what we need to do is move on and understand that I have 1 minute left and I need to do my closing. So I'm looking forward to coming back before you. I hope you'll have me back. I think I've spoken here 13 out of 15 years. And I've grown to love some of the people in this audience who I've met here, people I would never have met otherwise. And that's the value of our being together today. I hope this helped in your thinking about what the election will be. You noticed that I didn't tell you that it'll be President Buttigieg, but you know, who knows? I mean, honestly. Thank you very, very much.